esse encontro ao redor desse tema, que é um tema muito importante, já há muito tempo que deve ser abordado, mas a gente entende também que a pandemia, ela evidencia algumas das questões mais absurdas ao redor das prisões, do cárcere e todas as formas de exclusão social que existem e os processos culturais que estão envolvidos com isso. Então, a gente convidou o Brandon Cuffy, que é um arquiteto que tem um trabalho muito bonito, que é um projeto de tese de arquitetura, né? Não é um projeto teórico, é um projeto da nossa prática, e ele vai compartilhar com a gente esse conteúdo. Mas antes dele chegar, a gente vai compartilhar com vocês um pouco o início de um trabalho que se iniciou aqui no meio da pandemia. É um trabalho que a gente começou muito por uma manifestação dos alunos, alguns alunos que me contactaram com uma disposição e vontade de iniciar algum trabalho que tivesse uma voz crítica mediante o que a gente está vivendo. Então, a gente armou aqui uma pequena apresentação para vocês, como uma introdução a esse tema, né? Esse trabalho ele é realizado dentro do contexto de uma pesquisa que a gente tem em andamento, chamada Contra Visualizações, dentro do grupo Urbanismo, Crítica e Arquitetura no ProURB. Então, eu só vou fazer uma breve introdução sobre o que é esse trabalho Contra Visualizações, dentro do qual essa temática do cárcere agora está inserida. O termo Contra Visualizações, ele é um termo que foi utilizado por um teórico do urbanismo chamado Neil Brenner, e ele usa esse termo para falar sobre uma estrutura argumentativa, crítica do desenho, como as nossas formas de visualização e representação, elas podem trabalhar para dissolver algumas ideologias espaciais, como a gente pode usar o desenho para ampliar um campo de entendimento crítico sobre o que a gente vai fazer, né? Então, de certo modo, a gente entrar numa dimensão não só que vai além do documental, né? Que usa aquilo que é o desenho documento e inicia um outro processo de revelação crítica das condições espaciais que estão ali, né? Então, isso é algo que eu busco desenvolver com vocês como uma espécie de ferramenta para o desenvolvimento dos projetos, como a gente pode iniciar o processo de projeto não buscando encontrar uma evidência solta, mas algo que esteja nesse processo de desenho articulado, né, a partir do documental e que se evidencia de uma maneira clara para criar um outro campo de ação para nós, né? Então, essa abordagem, ela é ética e também estética, né? Esse par é muito importante. E então a gente vai apresentar para vocês o comecinho desses pensamentos, né? Eu queria agradecer muito os alunos que estão aqui envolvidos e presentes, a Marcele, o Wichan, principalmente, que esteve muito à frente da organização do Conversas de Meio-dia. A gente deve muito à força e presença da Marcele, a Camila, que foi pioneira também, Camila Mainier, em me convocar para a gente iniciar esse trabalho, Davi, Chagas, Matheus, Pinheiro e o Pedro Saldanha. Então, eles vão fazer uma apresentação de 5 minutos e a gente logo apresenta o nosso convidado, que deve estar chegando daqui a pouquinho, tá bom? Então, vou passar a palavra para o Matheus Pinheiro. E a gente... só alguns informes. Eu vou fazer uma tradução, pela primeira vez, vou fazer uma tradução simultânea pelo chat para tentar facilitar o entendimento geral. A nossa apresentação hoje ela vai ser toda com imagens do Brandon, não é só uma apresentação discursiva, né? Ela vai ser em inglês. O inglês do Brandon é bem americano, não é super simples, mas eu acho que alguns de vocês de qualquer forma consegue acompanhar pelos desenhos, e eu vou me esforçar em ir colocando algumas palavras-chave, vamos ver como a gente se sai, tá bom? Então, passo a palavra para o Matheus.
Boa tarde, gente. Vou começar, então, um pouquinho da apresentação da pesquisa. E, bom, num primeiro momento, a gente achou importante ressaltar o impacto que o momento pelo qual a gente está passando teve no processo de elaboração dessa pesquisa, como a Marina já apontou. A pandemia deixou a gente muito sensível em relação a essa problemática de um isolamento social. E, de alguma maneira, essas nossas reflexões encontraram uma certa equivalência na condição do cárcere. E não é sobre comparar os dois contextos ou hierarquizar, mas apenas de apontar para vocês a sensibilidade que motivou a gente nesse primeiro momento. E, além disso, existe uma outra camada de aproximação entre o Covid-19 e as prisões, né? Porque desde as primeiras pesquisas do grupo sobre as prisões ao redor do mundo, o coronavírus apareceu como uma questão relevante, já que a disseminação da doença é muito agravada pela condição dessas prisões. A gente pode citar a superlotação e os banheiros compartilhados como alguns dos exemplos dos facilitadores da potência que a doença tem dentro das cadeias, né? E, na verdade, o histórico das prisões e doenças não é novo e não surgiu com o coronavírus. Na verdade, as doenças tratáveis configuram a maior parte da morte dentro dos presídios hoje. Isso ficou muito marcado durante os surtos de tuberculose e AIDS na década de 90, por exemplo. E, para você ter uma ideia, a incidência de tuberculose chega a ser 4.500% maior dentro das cadeias do que fora delas. E, então, nesse momento inicial, esses dados e essas indignações estão conduzindo o nosso olhar para a condição do espaço dentro das cadeias, sobretudo as cadeias brasileiras.
Oi, gente. Então, a nossa pesquisa busca efetuar uma série de análises a respeito do sistema carcerário brasileiro com paralelos com o sistema carcerário chinês e estadunidense, que ocupa o lugar de países que mais encarceram pessoas no mundo, sendo os Estados Unidos em primeiro, o Brasil em segundo e a China em terceiro. Mas nós fizemos um gráfico aqui que mostra o número de presos a cada 100 mil habitantes e mostra que os Estados Unidos está bem à frente do Brasil e da China, sendo que os Estados Unidos têm uma população de aproximadamente de 300 milhões de habitantes, o Brasil 200 milhões e a China 1 bilhão. Então já era de se imaginar que a China estaria nesse ranking. Em um primeiro plano, nós fizemos uma revisão histórica com o objetivo de contextualizar o sistema penitenciário brasileiro em relação aos outros abordados, sendo o estadunidense e o próprio brasileiro pautados pela questão racial e o sistema chinês pautado pela questão cultural. Em um segundo plano, uma análise atual que contempla a situação dos presídios durante suas diversas pandemias, como o Matheus falou já. E, por fim, a discussão será voltada para os impactos do espaço de cárcere sobre os prisioneiros, também apontando as condições de projeto que se baseiam no punitivismo. Ao mesmo tempo, no âmbito político mundial, ainda ocorre uma política de extermínio à reclusão da população mais pobre, sobretudo negra. Da mesma maneira, esse espectro ideológico abrange não só a transgressão de direitos civis, mas também políticas contrárias ao interesse pela vida nos presídios. Nesse contexto, é necessário iniciar uma discussão a respeito das condições carcerárias atuais.
Então, no âmbito espacial, quando a gente pensa em arquitetura carcerária no Brasil como espaço de permanência prolongada, logo vem o desmanche da ideia de habitação. Na verdade, é o contrário, o ambiente se transforma num limitador de experiências e de crescimento pessoal. Em muitas celas compartilhadas, os presos dormem, se alimentam e passam quase o tempo todo do dia no mesmo espaço, que por muitas vezes se resume a cerca de 1 metro quadrado por pessoa, com privação de luz e privação de circulação do ar. Sendo assim, numa penitenciária, as atividades básicas do dia a dia, como respirar, pegar sol, comer, tomar banho, excretar e dormir, são momentos de tensão constante, né? Quando a gente se depara com a questão da superlotação e da política de encarceramento em massa, o espaço passa a ser, então, um corpo presente e substancial nessa problemática do encarceramento. uma vez que ocorre a normalização do amontoamento das pessoas sem condição mínima de conforto, privacidade, individualidade. Essas pessoas, então, acabam abreviando, né, na prática, informações numerológicas desse sistema seletivo e brutal, que mantém e fomenta a quebra de identidade pessoal, em que os indivíduos são dispostos e expostos de forma escancarada uns aos outros, como um espelho assim, perpétuo da sua própria imagem.
Através de uma investigação histórica, nosso grupo pôde constatar que o encarceramento na esfera brasileira ocorre de forma seletiva desde sua criação até a atualidade. No contexto do corpo que habita o ambiente carcerário, é necessário fazer um recorte a respeito do racismo estrutural que contempla a história desde o momento abolicionista. A partir disso, aquelas pessoas que antes eram tratadas como mercadoria, agora seriam consideradas livres e, portanto, estariam suscetíveis ao processo de aprisionamento direcionado. Outro ponto a ser considerado é a política de guerra às drogas, a qual é, até hoje, um dos propulsores da curva populacional carcerária, além de também se demonstrar aliada ao processo de encarceramento da população de baixa renda. Já no contexto espacial, essa pesquisa proporcionou resultados relacionados aos diferentes tipos de compartilhamento do espaço. É importante abordar o viés da arquitetura e como ela se demonstra de maneira punitiva em certas tipologias. Um exemplo dessa punição pode ser o compartilhamento de espaço encontrado nas escolas, que constantemente se mostra como lugar de encarceramento através de fatores como superlotação, compartilhamento de todos os ambientes, vigilância constante, pouco momento de contato com o meio externo, além de acesso visual da paisagem bloqueado. Todos esses fatores são referentes à exemplificação da maneira em que a construção e constituição de um ambiente compartilhado podem se demonstrar punitivas. O cenário do exemplo ele foi construído através de como a escola pode se apresentar análoga a um ambiente de aprisionamento, mas esses fatores também são encontrados em quartos, nas residências, em enfermarias coletivas dos hospitais e principalmente em prisões e presídios. Obrigado.
Pessoal, com isso a gente conclui a nossa breve introdução. A gente quer seguir com esses temas, debatendo isso no contexto da FAO. E então hoje a gente, estamos num contexto de muitos debates, muitas reuniões. Então a gente não vai poder se estender muito. A nossa intenção é terminar o encontro em torno de 2h15, e por isso a gente não vai poder se estender muito de uma sessão de perguntas ao final. Mas eu queria pedir para vocês mandarem as perguntas por escrito no chat, conforme eu vou estar fazendo a tradução, então se vocês puderem redigir a pergunta e inserir ao final da fala do Brandon, seria ótimo. Daí a gente vê o que é possível responder ainda na sessão e o que a gente guarda para uma próxima conversa e outros desdobramentos que a gente consiga fazer juntos, né? Então, a gente ainda tem que aguardar mais uns 5 minutos para a chegada do Brandon. A gente combinou a entrada dele nesse horário. Eu queria aproveitar para apresentá-lo, né? O título do trabalho dele Mutable Minds, Neural Proxies for the Imprisoned, que pode ser traduzido como mentes mutantes, mutáveis, proxies neurais para os aprisionados. O Brandon Cuffy é arquiteto e professor de arquitetura na Universidade da Pensilvânia. Atualmente, Brandon é pesquisador de design e computação na Kieran Timberlake Associates, na Filadélfia, na Pensilvânia, nos Estados Unidos. Ele ensinou estudos de design e cursos de prática profissional na Universidade do Texas, em Austin, e no Boston Architectural College. Brandon fundou Patos, um estúdio de design que explora oportunidades no cruzamento de design, dados e pesquisa, usando métodos de design e computação. O Patos usa dados como um dispositivo de narrativa para criar novos espaços, experiências interativas e visualizações de dados. Brandon recebeu seu diploma de bacharel em arquitetura pela Universidade da Virgínia e seu mestrado de arquitetura pela Harvard University Graduate School of Design. e atualmente está cursando mestrado em ciência da computação, com foco em Machine Learning pelo Georgia Institute of Technology. Seu trabalho foi publicado em mídia impressa e online. E só para contextualizar vocês um pouco, o Brandon, ele foi meu colega, a gente conviveu nessa loucura e intensidade do curso de mestrado em arquitetura, somos colegas há muitos anos, e esse trabalho dele é um trabalho muito único e intenso sobre essa temática do aprisionamento, né? Ele é uma pessoa que teve depois uma movimentação para esse campo, né, de visualização, computação, e então isso também é interessante para vocês verem um pouco, né, como dentro do ambiente acadêmico vocês podem, ao longo do tempo, isso direcionando a certas inflexões que parecem mais importantes, né? Eu tenho certa curiosidade para entender como a gente consegue ler esse trabalho como precursor também desse movimento que parte da arquitetura e entra nesse campo de experiência interativa, de visualização e novos espaços. Então, a gente vai dar mais um minutinho até o Brandon chegar e a gente inicia. Alguém tem alguma pergunta? Quer fazer alguma colocação nesse meio tempo? Obrigada, Eduardo. É ruim quando ninguém fala nada, né? Essa coisa do microfone desligado. E caiu a nossa apresentação. Tudo bem. O que nos motivou é o fato de essa questão das prisões é um tema muito espacial, né? É uma questão, essa denúncia, né, da condição espacial das prisões, eu há muitos anos acho que é uma questão para a gente trazer, sabe? Acho que é uma espécie de esquecimento social. There he is, Brandon. Welcome. Hey, how are you? I can't hear you. Pessoal, vocês podem tirar as câmeras agora? A gente fica... Brandon, can you hear me?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear
Great.
you. It's great to see you.
How are you?
I'm good. I'm alive. How are you?
Same.
Thank you so much for making it to this conversation. We've been looking forward to this, and so as I mentioned to you, we've opened the conversation to a larger group of students. We are now in the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, undergoing a process of change in our methods of teaching, as all universities are, but we deal especially with the context of exclusion, because a lot of our students don't have the same access to digital medias. So we've had this encouragement or need to try and share as much as we can of what's going on with us presently. So we've started looking into this theme of the... I'm sorry. Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm sorry, something happened here that my screen fell. So we started looking into this theme of imprisonment, and I immediately remembered your work, and I have been thinking about you, evoking your knowledge into this discussion. So I'm very, very appreciative of your participation, Brandon.
Sure.
I hope you're well. You're in Philadelphia at the moment?
I am.
Yes. How are things there?
Good. Very rainy. We have a tropical storm off the coast. it was kind of nice, yeah, looking up and digging up my thesis. It was like a trip down memory lane.
How long has it been since you've been engaged with this theme?
Off and on and tangentially, I would say I've been engaged with it since I started my thesis, you know, so about 7 or so years. I veered a little bit away from it, but the kind of biocentric and data approach that I kind of tried to explore in my thesis is still very relevant to what I do now.
Yeah, I look forward to seeing that. I see that you've merged into this theme of computation, and I'm very curious to see how we can find the precursors in your thesis that led you to this. I will be translating, Brandon, your presentation, so I'm going to be typing. So I won't interact much with you during this first part, if that's
Okay.
all right. So the word is yours.
Yeah, cool. Well, I would say thanks for having me. What I'm going to do, the bulk of the presentation is going to be kind of a walkthrough of a thesis that I did while I was at the Graduate School of Design, along with Marina. And it's really centered around the interaction between architecture and neuroscience, and kind of how I formulated a hypothesis of how architects might be able to engage the topic of neuroscience a little bit more confidently and a little bit more frequently, as it's very important to practice and essentially how the building environment impacts kind of the structural nature of our brain. And so I'm going to attempt to share my screen. We'll see if we have any success there. Wow. All right. Do you all see like a brain on like a page? Or can you see my screen at all?
Yes, we can
Okay.
see.
Cool. All right. So yeah, I'm just going to start by reading kind of the preface that I set up my thesis presentation with. So bear with me. Environment itself is a concept which has historically been considered interwoven, but have been increasingly divergent in the post-industrial society, which has given primacy to the mass-produced tectonic. In addition, the whimsical synthetic material culture afforded by the assembly line gave way to globally pervasive materials and the subsequent rise of globalization, creating architectural environments of non-identity space. Currently, trends are reversing. Designers and architects have made strong claims about the impact of buildings and spaces on the psychological and physical well-being of its inhabitants. Notably, humanists and phenomenological thinkers being the main audience. In addition, given the increasing quantification of a wide spectrum of building criteria and characteristics, contemporary architects are pushed beyond philosophical claims and called upon to consider more rigorous biometric parameters as frameworks for their design. And that's kind of a statement that just sets up this idea that this neuroscientist that I spoke to during my thesis research kind of summed it up very nicely in this quote that you see here: change the environment, change the brain, change the behavior. And this is a quote by Fred Gage, who's a neuroscientist who actually discovered the concept of neuroplasticity. And what that means is that typically it's understood, or formerly it was understood, that most of a person's growing and learning takes place most rapidly between the ages of infancy and 5 years old. And after that, the ability for your brain to learn new and novel things kind of decreases over time. But Dr. Gage actually discovered that if presented with new and unexperienced situations and contexts, that your brain can actually forge new connections between neurons to create new experiences that your brain can commit to its store of memory. And so architects for quite some time have been kind of formulating systems and frameworks and armatures to essentially reconcile the relationship between the body and space. Here you have Corb and his 5 points in architecture, and I'm sure you all are familiar with this quite well, but trying to formulate how should or how can the body and space interact in kind of a symbiotic way. And this has gone back to antiquity. Here we have the primitive hut painting, the kind of impetus for creating shelter. It's kind of an innate part of something that humans seek. We all live in houses, we're secluded from the exterior environment. There's kind of a primitive drive there that, you know, on many levels, architects are trying to negotiate daily. And then here we have the Vitruvian Man, which is another kind of test of how do we then create scalar architecture that interacts appropriately with the scale of a person. Here presented with the kind of idealistic view of human proportion and how that can potentially translate to geometric kind of structures and constructs. Then we have Corb's kind of similar version in the modular. And then on the flip side, if the previous few examples were more objective, kind of can we find a tectonic to kind of suggest this interaction? On the other side, we have phenomenological thinkers, you know, most notably like Stephen Hall or Peter Zumthor, who kind of think along the lines that, you know, the architectural space that we create, the play of light and shadow, actually does something beyond just separate space, but actually has quite an effect on the actual kind of mental or mind state of the persons inhabiting the space. And therefore, architecture can go beyond just being a physical experience and can actually kind of be quite a significant meta experience. Here's some of Stephen Hall's work, and at the bottom are just like some quotes that I pulled from their work that kind of describe some of the intentionality behind some of the concepts. And I'll try to kind of go through this quickly so that we can get to kind of the main part, which is related, how this kind of relates to understanding the potential of prison design moving forward, and so that you guys can ask questions. And then thinking on the speculative, where you can imagine kind of direct one-to-one interaction between kind of the body state and the architectural space. We have, you know, here David Green's Living Pod, which is a reactive space that actually interacts with both the physical and psychological nature of the human being. Also, J.G. Ballard's Psychotropic House in his story, 1,000 Dreams of Stella Vista, is another example of kind of designers and kind of architectural thinkers beginning to see what can happen if we actually tune the body state and the mind state to an architectural construct. Involuntary Prisons of Architecture by Rem Koolhaas, just reimagining the kind of Berlin Wall is actually like kind of a habitable thing here. And then the pivot kind of in the mid 20th century shifted a little bit from kind of architects and designers and kind of theorists pondering this question to actually people in the kind of environmental psychology and neuroscience field as technology became available. This here is Jonas Salk. If any of you know the Salk Institute by Louis Kahn in California, it's actually named after him. And I put this in here because Jonas Salk was the first doctor to kind of suggest that space potentially has a direct physical impact on the structure of how we think and how our brain forms ideas. So, quick story, Jonas Salk was in his lab in the United States, in a basement, trying to figure out the polio vaccine, trying to figure out a successful solution to it, but he couldn't get it. And so what he did was he took a trip to the Abbey of Assisi, which is what you see here, which is in Italy. And he began to work in a much kind of loftier, brighter space, which is very different from the basement that he was in the US. And it was here in this space that he was able to kind of formulate the correct solution to the polio vaccine, which obviously he then took back to the States and distributed. But after this process, he kind of thought that there was something fundamentally different between the space that he was working with in the United States in his basement and the space that he was working with in the Abbey. So as he kind of started to kind of document this process and do further research, others also became aware of some of the work that Jonas Salk was doing, notably J.G. Gibson, who is an environmental psychologist, who also began to kind of crack this question of understanding kind of perception and how the kind of form and framework of space begin to shift how a person can operate and think in kind of a tangible way. So if phenomenological thinkers kind of suggest that kind of bright, airy spaces are transcendent, Jonas Salk and J.J. Gibson were kind of trying to figure out what was the actual biological correlate to those claims. And so the next few slides are a series of panels that I put together that actually start to break down some of the things that we typically talk about when we describe architecture: color, texture, depth, perspective, proportion, smoothness, sharpness, and start to break down how those things actually plug into certain parts of the brain and where those particular components and elements of architecture are interpreted by your mind. So here we have the occipital lobe, which is kind of in the back of your brain. And this is kind of where all of your vision is kind of translated and interpreted by your brain. And one thing that's important is that to forge new connections in your brain based on the physical space that you're in, it depends on the release of what are called neurotransmitters, which are little signals that your neurons kind of release and exchange with one another to create memories and connections. And so on each slide, you'll see that I'll have a kind of localization of where the particular aspect, right now we're talking about sight, where it is located in the brain. So here's the occipital lobe. And then somewhere on the slide, usually I'll have the neurotransmitters that are triggered by this sense or this ability in your brain. So here we have a series of colors and the types of neurotransmitters that are released by it. And I think most notably here, everybody can recognize yellow, associated with light that comes from the sun, releases serotonin, which is a kind of social neuron. And here is green, which we associate obviously with foliage and grass and trees. It releases something called GABA, which is short name for a much longer name of a neurotransmitter. And it also releases melatonin, which is something that helps us sleep, helps comfort us. And because we're talking about, this talk is in the context of prisons, I just put gray on this slide as well, because gray has been proven via fMRI scans, which is something that, a technology that scientists and doctors use to understand how the brain operates and reacts to things, is the least stimulative color as viewed by the brain, the human brain. Here, just talking about textures and understanding that there's actually a portion of your brain in the parietal lobe, which is kind of like up here, that helps your body understand textures. And what we have here is just a graph of neuron 22. Your brain is specific enough that it understands textures and particular orientations. And so this particular neuron 22, is actually assigned to understanding textures and patterns on a 2D plane. So you'll see that its reaction here is much higher to this orientation of grids. And this is a kind of hypothetical abstract environment as opposed to the other orientations, because other cells in your brain, other neurons, are assigned and responsible for understanding grids and patterns in other orientations. So these are kind of some components that architects use material patterns, using brick patterns, concrete. We use all of these things constantly in architecture, but what is it really doing to us? How can we kind of augment these things? Here is just kind of sound and understanding that your brain has a resting metronome, a resting kind of rhythm that it operates on, and that can be augmented by the exterior environment. So, like noisy hospitals, they with kind of hard, echoey surfaces, they kind of disrupt this metronome, which also disrupts the kind of rhythms within your brain, which can lead to agitation and lack of relaxation, for kind of hospital patients that are trying to, necessarily sleep. And then the idea, this is one that's a little bit, previously thought of as a stretch. Is there a seat for creativity in the brain? Is there actual kind of biological correlate to it? And there actually is. There were studies done by, Joanne Levy, that kind of showed the difference in how the brain operates in kind of higher spaces. She did a 10-foot space and an 8-foot space, and how that affects creativity and acuity. So lower kind of ceiling heights are more apt for detail-oriented, specific type of work, and for more abstract and creative work, kind of higher spaces are kind of preferable, as shown by her study. And this is one of the things that Jonas Salk experienced when he went to that abbey. And here the difference you can see are some of the neurotransmitters that are released when operating in spaces of kind of low compact nature and those of kind of more expanded nature. And then here the idea of amygdala bias. So humans have a natural tendency to avoid sharp things. I think everybody knows that. But it's actually something that's built into our brains. And we tend to avoid sharp things and are more apt to interact with smoother things. And this, if I zoom in, this is a neuron scan, a fMRI scan of a brain of a person presented with smoother objects versus sharp objects. And you see, if you can see here, you see a little red highlight in the brain within the amygdala that shows that there's a kind of visceral and physical reaction to sharp objects within the brain. And this is kind of one of the more fun parts that I found interesting within my thesis, which is understanding the hippocampus. So this is like the seat of how our brains understand and measure out and interpret three-dimensional space. So this is a study done with a rat brain. And what they did was they released the rat into a finite box, and they just let it walk around. And what they found was that there were a group of cells in their brain that actually fired at almost equal distances around the finite box that it was walking in. And these became known as grid cells. And so what that started to suggest is that there are three or four main kind of cell types that interact with three-dimensional space. There are place cells, grid cells, and head cells. And here I'll walk you through what each one is. And this is kind of for the sake of this example, an abstract kind of prison cell, because that's what the context of my thesis is. And so if we start out with a kind of blank room or a blank cell, there's nothing in it. This is just your visual perception of that space, empty, four walls. But the way your brain interprets it is that your grid cells begin to meter out and dimension the space as you kind of go through it. And they have what are called border cells. These are cells in your brain that are responsible for identifying edges to the space that you're in. So you would have 1, 2, 3, 4, technically 5 of them. And then you would have your grid cells, which help you understand the meter of the space. And then in addition to that, say you place a window in a prison cell. You would have then place cells. Place cells identify salient or important objects within your environment. And many times in prison cells, there are trees, and sometimes there are not right outside that window. And what I wanted to, what I wanted to kind of explain this sequence of images as is essentially the fundamental way that your brain forms memories. Your brain essentially forms memories when a series of neurons fire kind of synchronously together. So a lot of prisoners are, when they're in their cells, they'll be seen looking out their window. And the reason is because all of these systems are firing together essentially at this corner. You have your grid cells, your border cells, your place cells, and your head cells all firing in this corner, which makes this area of this room much more important than any other area in the room. And this becomes important when architects are kind of starting to form space and understand what are the various components of the particular design that they're working with. And here is just a grid of essentially a spectrum of all of these components just kind of played out to develop a toolkit that I was to work with when actually jumping into the design portion of my thesis and understanding what are all of the neural correlates to ceiling heights, sharpness versus roundness, color, orientation, transparency, topology and topography, and also kind of curvature and rotation. So with these kind of two toolkits of understanding the neural correlates and the kind of spatial implications of those neural correlates, I jumped into the idea of thinking that maybe when Corb was formulating his 5 points, it was really, really a desire for him to kind of engage kind of the seat of human mind in a particular way, rather than think of it as kind of POT and whatnot, thinking of it actually as components of the kind of human brain or the human person that we're trying to interact with. And so in the end, the environment is almost like a mathematical function. It essentially is, you have kind of you have your environment, which is like a function, input, and then you get your augmented self. Essentially, your environment changes you, and that kind of runs in essentially a cycle. And so this is where I kind of pivot from the kind of neuroscience research into the application and area of investigation that I was interested in. And that is essentially kind of prison or incarceration. And looking at that on a spectrum of the types of environments that exist in society. So a free society is essentially a convivial institution. Essentially, you as a person can put yourself in any environment and become essentially anything you want. That's kind of the one end of that spectrum. And then you go to the other end, which is a total institution, such as a prison or a monastery. These are institutions that when you're input into them are intended to augment your behavior in a very specific way for a very specific outcome. They essentially kind of, they're conformist institutions, essentially. So this is kind of the wide spectrum. And then in the middle, you have essentially intermediary institutions such as like schools or hospitals that you go into those environments, you still kind of have free choice, but there are rules or limits to what you can do within that environment. They don't necessarily kind of expect or force one outcome, but you kind of are allowed to be free within the confines of the rule set that they prescribe. And so looking at that another way, looking at kind of a free society or any society where kind of people are kind of existing together, you have the idea of incarceration or the total institution where somebody is involuntarily extracted from the kind of larger society into kind of a separate or isolated condition. And this is kind of the area of study that I kind of pursued in the remainder of the presentation. This is just a diagram that I was kind of showing to speculate about an ideal kind of scenario for somebody who is extracted from society for a penal reason. I suggested that, you know, more interaction with society is necessary than just total isolation. And you'll see kind of why I made that diagram. And the idea of a penitentiary or a prison, the idea of a penitentiary, the name actually comes from the word penitence, which is essentially if you're isolated from society for an infraction or for doing something that was against the societal norm, you're put into prison originally for the idea of penitence or reform so that you can come back into society, kind of change and correct it. But the idea and the kind of history of prisons has made it a place that it's just a storehouse for people who don't comply with the societal norm. And so instead of it being a place for rehabilitation to kind of help people or direct people on a more positive path, it's just become a repository. And so that when people get out of prison, because of many failures of the institution to rehabilitate people, you know, this big hand over here represents the idea that they're not accepted. So there's the idea that the original intent of reform is kind of failed within this construct of this institution. And so here, I won't kind of belabor all of these next few slides, but what I did was I broke down the various parts of a typical United States prison, being a cell, intake, where individuals come in, and there's kind of social spaces, which in many US prisons are called day rooms. And so what I did was, I can just show you an example. Through research looking at some issues and problems that prisons have within the United States, such as overcrowding, small area, limited access to light, material hardness. And what I did was I broke those down into how those translate into negative neurological biases. So for instance, crowding kind of suggests or has, I guess you could say, incites anxiety in many. Many of these do. And so what that translates to in your brain is a decrease in the proportion of 5-HT to 5-HT serotonin, which are two slightly 5-HT to 5-HT3 serotonin, which is a certain kind of transfer or translation of serotonin in your brain that is conducive to keeping kind of stress levels down and whatnot. And crowding and some of these other factors actually disrupt that that translation. And what that leads to is decreased sociability, depressive behavior. And so all of these issues or common problems in prisons, they're not just issues on the surface, but they actually affect the physical nature and physical build of our brain in a negative way. And so I do the same thing for here. And I also do it down here for the idea of limited access to, you know, food and whatnot. And so to kind of step back a little bit and kind of frame how the kind of prison system in the United States kind of got to this point, kind of in the early 17th century, when individuals kind of started coming to the Americas, the idea of a prison was just a place to put people for penitence, put people there so that they can understand what they did wrong, fix it, and then come back out. It was the idea of total isolation. Just put them by themselves, and they'll figure it out, and they'll come back, and they'll be okay. But scientists, even then, early on, doctors found out that this extreme isolation was detrimental to the human mind, and people actually went crazy. So the next kind of iteration of the U.S. prison system was the idea of the panopticon. So this is a model that has prisoners essentially arrayed in a circle where you can have a few guards in the middle that can see everybody. And by the time we get to the 1800s, the population is increasing. The model kind of changed to what was the early signs of the cell block model, which we kind of have now. And this is not only to house more people, but it was also an economic model, because as prison institutions were able to house more people, they were also able to get economic benefit. They can get essentially free or cheap labor from this mass population that they have in a confined area. And then on the right, we have the kind of more typical cell block design that we see today, which minimizes the number of guards or salaries that you have to pay essentially, and maximizes the number of prisoners. And the two primary systems at the turn of the century were the Penn system and the Auburn system. The Penn system was very much focused on isolating prisoners, not letting them socialize, not letting them work or have a vocation, but just isolating them so that they can essentially achieve penitence. But as I mentioned before, this model was not favorable because it made people go insane. And so the Auburn system is actually the root of many of the prison systems in the United States currently. And that is, it's the cell block. It allows for vocation, some inmate interaction, and it also allows for vocations which benefit the state, essentially. So this is a more appealing economic model for many states. And this is Attica, which is in upstate New York. And this is one of the more infamous prisons in the United States. And this is what many of them look like. They're large, they're fortresses. And this idea is of out of sight, out of mind, is that many prisons are also very far away from urban centers, and they are isolated on large plots of farmland that many times prisoners work for the benefit of the state. But they're very isolated and they're just not nice places. And I wanted to put this in there as a counterpoint to a lot of research being done in Europe to kind of think of the idea of the humanity of the prisoner first as a way of thinking about prison design. And this kind of looks like an office building almost. It looks like somewhere anybody would go to have a good time or go to work, but this is actually a prison. And there are many more, and if Marina wants, I can send some more links to those other prisons, which are kind of really turning this tide on how we think about the humanity and space for those incarcerated. And here is where I start to translate some of the typical aspects of organizing inmates into maybe a new formula for thinking about prisoners and how they might be housed for more proper targeted rehabilitation. Right now, we have a series of crimes. Right now, the United States has really four main security levels that they categorize prisoners into based on the severity of the crime, not based on how or what they need for rehabilitation. So what you get are groups of people that are neurologically and psychologically very different, grouped all together, which can make for an environment that's very stressful, violent, and unsafe, which we find in many, many prisons. And these four types, which are the primary types within of diagnoses within prison populations, is antisocial, impulsive, aggressive, and emotionally disturbed. And this is just kind of a quick segue to understand kind of the magnitude of the issue within the United States. This is a map of recidivism rates, which is if a person gets released from prison, the tendency of them to reoffend or commit another crime within the first 2 years of their release. And so we see here from an institution that's supposed to be rehabilitating people, there's very high recidivism rates across the US. So that means that the rehab or intervention that happens in prison is not very effective. In the United States, though, you know, if you look over here, we have 4% of the prison population, 4% of the world population, I think about 4.25%, but we have almost a quarter of the prison population in the world. You see other countries like China, Russia, Brazil, they have prison populations that are on par with their percentage of the world population. So we have a very high incarceration rate within the United States. And then looking at the breakdown of budgets and how much is spent on housing incarcerated individuals. And then here looking at the breakdown of what is a potential avenue for more effective treatment and rehabilitation. So looking at the percentage of inmates with mental health issues, 55% of U.S. Inmates. Uh-oh, my battery is out. Uh-oh, hold on.
Take your time, Brendan.
Yeah, you're good. This is looking at kind of mental health issues within prisons and understanding that 55% of the population has mental health issues, and that breaks down into 55% of men and 73% of women. So there's a big disparity there that could be fertile for more investigation, for more effective treatment. And here is even a further breakdown of that 55%. So we have, hyperinsomnia, psychomotor, kind of depressive. So there's a range of things that offer architects a little insight into how they can leverage some of that research that I mentioned before to address some of these issues in the design of prisons. And so here we kind of rethink those classifications that I just mentioned, and we take all of these various types of prisoners, and we actually aggregate them based on condition. This is obviously a student thesis, so it's idealized, and these might not be the correct categorizations, but the idea is that there's a continuity between conditions between many of these diverse populations that could potentially be brought together for more effective treatment. And here, what I'm doing is essentially breaking down each of the kind of major offense types into their, I guess, neurological categories, and denoting what the neurotransmitter kind of deficiency is. So for impulsive individuals, it's a dopamine imbalance. And I do that kind of for each one. And here is just the understanding that all of these issues are not exclusive, but they kind of overlap in a number of ways. And then here for each type of individual, understanding what are the main deficiencies. So low serotonin for those that are aggressive, low dopamine, high epinephrine, norepinephrine, and low melatonin. And understanding how architects can interpret that into spatial ideas that in turn boost or decrease certain deficiencies that are kind of noted in this column. And I do that for each type so that we can start to translate from the more scientific to the more architectural and tectonic ideas so that architects can actually begin to have agency in this process. And this is kind of the last one, yeah. So we have the kind of deficiency here, we have the architectural idea, and then we have what that architectural idea actually essentially does. So if you're kind of low in serotonin, there are schemes or ideas that you can implement to actually boost and balance serotonin. So that's the end of the research portion of my thesis. I could quickly just show the
Can I just quick comment? I could never understand what you were doing when we were working together, and now I understand why I couldn't understand it. I have you explain to me what you were doing, and it's very complex. I hope I hope everyone is following, but it's really beautiful, Brendan. Thank you.
And if you have any questions, like feel free, because right now I'm just gonna go 5 seconds through the actual design project.
Let's go all the way, and then we can take some time for questions at the end.
Okay. So essentially what I did was I began to develop a series of cell types for the various kind of conditions. So on the left here was an idealistic cell for antisocial person, which has a higher aptitude for softer spaces and more meditative activities that would allow for the increase in dopamine and serotonin, and essentially in order to create a very comfortable environment. This is, and I still question this one, is for antisocial individuals who, if you're antisocial, you lack dopamine slightly, a little bit of serotonin, and it's not necessarily ideal for you to directly engage with others, but you want to also feel that you're not alone. So this is kind of an idea of this ethereal transparency between cells. There's no actual cell, but a series of transparent and translucent dividers between people. So you can have you can have your own space, but you can also still be kind of aware of others. And I do that kind of for the additional inmate types. And then I kind of break down those even further into all the specific moves in creating the particular cell type, dividing out the materials, and understanding at each step what are the neurocorrelates of all of these kind of steps and tweaks that I'm kind of doing to the kind of living space for each individual that will potentially help or contribute to the rehabilitation of that individual. And all of this is in the context of, here, I can zoom in a little bit. That is not, these are not very high-res images. But all of that in the context of the schedules, because we know that activity, interaction, and certain engagement is positive as well, and showing that throughout the course of one person's day, how the different activities that they're doing can group together and overlap with one another, again, to reinforce the positive output of neurological connections and neurotransmitters that will contribute to the betterment of that person. Because one thing I also found during my research is that, what is it? What neurotransmitter is it? Oxytocin is, your neurotransmitters ebb and flow during the day. So you have high levels of some in the morning, afternoon, and at night. Oxytocin is one that actually peaks in the morning at about 9 a.m. So it's actually better to group social activities in the morning for individuals that are incarcerated so that they can get more out of the interaction between individuals. The reason that we all get tired at night is because melatonin peaks around 9 or 10, between 8 and 10 p.m., which is our sleep neurotransmitter. So when those are kind of spiking, that's when we fall asleep. And the opposite of that is histamine, which peaks in the very early morning between, I think, 5 and 9, which is what wakes us up. So the ebb and flow of these neurotransmitters is very important to understand throughout the day so that we can maximize the kind of positive effects when we're thinking about designing spaces. And these were just kind of fun kind of aggregations of these ideas into a built project. Or not a built project, but a speculative architectural project. So this is the kind of area for the antisocial individuals, so the layers of transparency. This is the area for the antisocial. So this is kind of like a womb-like space. Almost every edge in this and surface in this area is rounded for inclusiveness and to reduce any idea of aggression. And then this is the area for aggressive individuals who have a dopamine deficiency. And so what that means is, they have a dopamine excess. And so what that means is that they have more energy and they have more, they have more energy than they know what to do with. So the idea here is to create a complex, kind of challenging environment so that all of that extra kind of amp that they have can be put to use. So this is the idea of creating an environment of complexity for very kind of, I don't want to say intermittent, but the interactions between individuals that would occupy this space would happen kind of less often than in some of the other spaces. This is just a section through the idea. So this is the space that we were just looking at. This is actually a theater. This is the space for the emotionally imbalanced. And then here through that is the space for the antisocial. I think that's it. Yep.
Wow, Brendan, how do we clap online, guys? Very nice. It's a beautiful section. Thank you so much. I'm sure everyone must be like, it's a very different kind of project. You know, I was always very curious about the curve, and I think we were going through the same at the same time. And, but it's really, really amazing. I love how you use all the tools of design and all the technology to do something effective. It's not blah, blah, it's this and then this, and this is how we can, you know, tame the aesthetics. So thank you, Brendan.
Yeah, sure.
I'm very, very happy to see this. It's like, we're lucky. I know these guys who know this.
Yeah, and one last thing that I wanted to just say is that after I completed my thesis, I actually worked with a psychologist at Yale to publish some of the essays that I submitted as a part of my thesis, who's actually working on restorative justice. And she does work in environmental psychology as well. So I think it was just nice for me to kind of understand that this, even though this project is lofty and kind of idyllic, there are very much real roots to some of this work that people are actually trying to implement right now, like out there in society. But yeah, I'm free to answer any questions or any thoughts that anybody might have.
All right. So we have one question, which is from another professor that I'm going to read out to you. We won't be able to stay long for questions because we've had these emergency meetings at the university, specifically this week, Brendan, because they just launched a new calendar for remote teaching. So everything is kind of falling apart as we speak. And I my colleague saying, I'm going to be late, but I'm not canceling it. So we won't be able to go past 1:30, you know, your time. But so this is Kawe, he's a colleague, and he says, thank you for the great presentation. I am sorry that I will have to leave in the middle. I will leave 2 questions if Marina finds it appropriate, and I will definitely watch the end of the presentation later. We're recording this, I didn't tell you, right?
Okay.
Sorry. When you were describing the stressor, okay, wait. Question 1. In the spectrum between convivial institutions and total institutions, it seems that the more architecture, the more control to discipline behaviors, right? The more there's architecture, the more there's control. Can we imagine an architecture that empowers freedom to become whoever we want, or is architecture condemned to condemn?
Yeah, no, that's something I thought about often, because then you think about, related to like this kind of architecture freedom, you think about like the Fun Palace, you think about like Archigram, you think about these kind of whimsical constructs that essentially are architecture a la carte. You can do essentially anything that you want. And I think the kind of difference between some of the things like I might have talked about and like those ideas is that those ideas are essentially a part of what you would call the convivial institution. They're kind of a framework of like freedom and choice, whereas because we don't have an ideal society, there are institutions within society that have intent, essentially. So there's like schools, prisons, some of the things I mentioned before. And I think the question that I was trying to get at was, within these institutions of either semi or total control, how do you still kind of embrace the kind of humanity, and how do you still embrace the kind of interaction that's going to take place between the human body and the environment? And I think I chose the context of prisons because, one, it's almost a control environment. They're almost like the same everywhere. And there's a lot of research related to what that particular type of environment is, what the impacts are on kind of the human psyche. Whereas more, kind of, if you think about like something like the Fun Palace, there's no kind of control there. There's nothing to kind of gauge or set as a datum for comparison. And so that makes it a little bit tougher when you're thinking about kind of free-form, a la carte ideas within design. But I think I think like in a scary world where data is being collected on everything, I think things that are approaching now, like deep learning and data mining, are ways that architecture and architects can actually get insight into the nature and tendency of people within convivial institutions and operate essentially on those assumptions.
Okay, question number 2. I'm gonna ask, this is a question from a student, Mariana Jassis. She wants to ask about the importance of contact with nature and animals for mental health. Wouldn't that be recommendable to all imprisoned?
Most certainly. I think that the one neurotransmitter that I mentioned called GABA, it's short for GABA something. It's a very long name. But that is the neurotransmitter that is kind of released by our engagement with nature. And that was why I had that little tree like outside of that window in that cell, because that is definitely a part of the toolkit. I didn't focus as much on that within the thesis. I don't even think I have a tree in my in my design, but it was definitely a part of the research and documentation that I did. Very important.
So now there's another question from Eduardo Sanches Salsamendi, who thanks you extensively for the presentation. He's doing research in his master's on the same theme. And Eduardo is asking, do you believe that it is possible to overcome a reformist and technocratic mentality and move to a situation of less prison through changes in the prison design?
That is one, that's a very good question. And my assumption and my approach was, again, because we live in an imperfect kind of society, moving forward, we're probably going to have prisons. And if we do, how can we make them better? I think to answer his question, I'm a proponent of less prisons, even though I designed one. But I think whether it's in a prison or not, I think as you see now in society, there's a very big focus on mental health and understanding how it could be engaged with as early as possible. I still think the body of research that I began to build up is still applicable outside of a prison context, because all it is a body of research that helps intervention to cause positive change, essentially. So yeah, I'm not really a proponent of prisons, but my attitude was, well, if we're going to have prisons, like, how can we make them better?
Mm-hmm. Okay. So another question from Thales Calazans. It's a tough one. How could you translate these propositions of the incarceration system to programs of housing programs for post-prison scenarios that could be effective long-term? So I guess he's asking, let's see, yeah, how could you envision this continuity from outside of the prison so that architecture could assist in the insertion, right? How would you pair these concepts with housing for post-imprisonment?
I didn't look at that too much, but I think one thing that I didn't mention was that throughout my thesis presentation, when I did it back in 2013, my best friend was actually wearing EEG throughout my presentation, which actually translated her brain waves through Rhino and Grasshopper, which maybe many of you use, into geometry. And so that idea was to convey that, again, this body of research isn't necessarily just abstract, but it's actually possible. And I implemented, that very small experiment there, so that essentially when you're either in incarceration or you come out and transition, there is a way to interact with the state of your brain, essentially, and to kind of aggregate and mine that data to understand how structurally your brain is progressing. And so, like, in a really kind of scary world, like a Big Brother type of world, you know, that could be a potential alternative to essentially tracking progress once somebody kind of leaves that institution, or if you're in any kind of context, because we have the ability to, with fMRIs, with EEGs, to actually understand what's going on in your brain, understand any kind of lacks, imbalances, or deficiencies, and be able to mend them in a particular way. And so that is like a way of, like, I guess, tracking or understanding progress once you leave a particular institution like that.
Okay, and so I'm gonna ask one last one. There's tons of comments thanking you for the presentation.
Cool.
We're getting used to how we process these things, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is the first of these lecture series that we usually do around lunchtime at the school, but now the school is closed, so it's good that you suggested this time of the day because it sticks to our tradition. So Bruno Paragó asks, how do you see contemporary forms of incarceration and approach to the subject? And are there places with characteristics related to your study?
Yeah, I think the kind of Leo Ben prison is one of them. I think it's somewhere in Western Europe. And I've actually, because you asked me to do this lecture, I actually just Googled to see if there's any other, because when I did my thesis, there were two that were really embodying this type of work in their design. But now I see there's like around 9. They're all, again, in Western Europe. And again, I'll send you the link actually to this article that I saw. But yeah, there's about 9 prisons that are embodying this kind of research, that are working with both scientists and environmental psychologists and architects to formulate a more human-centered approach to imprisonment. And it's not even, like, in that context, I wouldn't even call it imprisonment anymore. They're embodying a kind of a human-centered, kind of dignified approach to rehabilitation, because the assumption is with some of those prisons, and typically with all prisons, is that when you go in, you're not there forever. You're going to come back out into society. And so these 9 prisons, they're kind of working on that premise and trying to do the most they can for the individuals there so that they can come back kind of whole. So a lot of them are including, you know, kind of various face types, like I was starting to get at, and also the social aspect of really integrating society and families into the rehabilitation process. So it's not like you have like a visiting day, but like the families are integrated into the rehabilitation. But yeah, there's a good number of them now.
Good. I think we're gonna have to stay in touch, my friend.
Yeah, we should follow up.
Questions as we move along, but I really want to thank you on behalf of the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, as we have this very fragile moment, and the sharing of knowledge is as appreciated as can be from our part. So thank you, Brandon. I hope you're well and you stay well. Now I'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, Marina. Yeah, let's follow up.
Everyone for participating. Thanks for all the questions. Tô falando inglês com todo mundo. Beijos.
Bye.
And each other soon. Okay.